So let's get to our event proper. I'm really, really pleased to kick this one off. It's one of my favorite people I get to deal with the Writer Center as both an instructor and a person we've done a couple events with. So it's my pleasure to welcome Judith Harris. Judith Harris is the author of 3 books of poetry and a critical book, Signifying Pain, Constructing and Healing the Self Through Writing, and the critical book, The Poetry of Loss, Romantic and Contemporary Elegies, which I've read and is very excellent. Judith has taught at GW University and Catholic University, and as I mentioned here, at the Writer Center. Her poetry has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Republic, Slate, Harvard Review, The Nation, The American Scholar, The New Republic, Alaska Quarterly Review, The Hudson Review, and the syndicated newspaper column, American Life in Poetry. Her essays have appeared in the AWP Chronicle, College English, the Canadian Journal of Psychoanalysis, Psychoanalysis, Culture and Society, the American Journal of Psychoanalysis, the British Journal of Guidance and Counseling, and the Midwest Quarterly. She was a fellow at Frost Place in Yaddo? I've never said that out loud, I just realized until I was standing on stage. I'm going to go with Yaddo, and has presented her work at the Library of Congress and the American Psychoanalytic Association. Her collection, The Bad Secret, was nominated by LSU Press for the Pulitzer Prize. From critics on the poetry of loss, quote, "Our lives are filled with losses and gains. We keep mental representations, mental doubles of lost persons with whom we have had meaningful connections. Through poetry, Judith Harris describes her relationships with such mental doubles. This book opens windows to explore the role of creativity in human psychology." And that was Valman Volkan, Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at UVA. And another quote, "Judith Harris is that rare combination of extraordinary poet and gifted literary scholar." Amen. Using psychoanalysis, trauma theory, and the latest research on bereavement, she shows how language can transmute grief into imperishable art. The poetry of loss is a profound study that deepens our understanding of love, loss, and recovery. And that was Jeffrey Berman, author of Dying to Teach, a memoir of love, loss, and learning. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Judith to the stage, and the podium is yours. Judith, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm going to begin with a rather formal paper and then read new poems. I'm calling this paper The Curious Strangeness, Poetry, Psychoanalysis, and Trauma. The relationship between poetry and psychoanalysis has been explored for more than a century, beginning with Freud, with practitioners from both spheres working to unravel the threads of trauma, healing, and creativity that run within each domain and inevitably links them together. The painstaking elaboration of language is key to accessing and then making sense of unconscious or otherwise disruptive emotional content. The language of art fills the hollowness of pain with something else, the language of survival, testimony, sociality, and critical focus. Over many years, I've been writing about the intersections of psychoanalysis and poetry as a mental process. Why do some early occurrences generate dissociation or get split from the rest of the mind? Transferring repressed trauma or grief with the belief that an analyst or reader can shoulder or contain it seems very much at the heart of lyric poetry, which from its origins of the ancient Greek lyric in 630 BC, often lamenting unrequited love or loss, was a means of giving voice to painful emotions, and therefore continues to resonate throughout the centuries. From Lacan, language is a tomb of our alienated desire. It is where we bury the lack that language simultaneously fills and empties again. While Freud's cultural context concentrated his trauma theory on the neuroses seen in soldiers who fought in World War I, His analysis of the divide between the conscious and unconscious processing of traumatic experiences created the framework upon which increasingly complex theories have been refined. Freud regarded the literary endeavor as imaginative kind of play or spiel, akin to daydreaming, and lay beyond the understanding of the writer, therefore relegating the artistic process to an act related to sublimation. By the mid-20th century, American confessional poets such as Lowell, Sexton, Berryman, and Plath worked with their respective psychoanalysts to explore the themes of trauma that fundamentally informed their poetry and also brought their clinical experiences directly into their poems. While institutionalized, Lowell famously stated that excavating his childhood traumas was like finding a gold mine for his writing of life studies, and his influence on both Sexton and Plath can never be underestimated. In Dawn Scorsese's An Accident of Hope, she connects Sexton's poems, therapy sessions, and tells the tale of a great poet, a traumatized and traumatizing woman, and a patient whose challenges to her therapist foreshadow relational understandings of what harms and what heals. Although the confessional poets wrote about private pain, it was hoisted on the precept that mental anguish is not the sole province of the individual, but is symptomatic of a larger society. As I argued in a very long article in the AWP Chronicle, in response to Louise Gluck's The Forbidden, in which she applies the tags of narcissistic and self-indulgent to the poetry of Sharon Olds and Linda McHariston, I suggest that both poets do not squelch rage and terror by answering to a dubious aesthetics or by keeping a polite distance from their subjects. Instead, women's confessional poetry tied to psychoanalysis is constructive of an ideological and political movement, not to be oversimplified as complaint, and reveals the positive belief in expression as a liberation from the powers that would disarm the truth. Plath presaged feminism, interrupting male dominance, as did Sexton. As patients receiving psychiatric treatment, their poetry offered a way of making sense of their life. My research into the intersection of poetry and psychoanalysis as manifested in art leads me to believe that the personal lyric tied to traumatic memory of childhood surfaces through association. Liminality with regard to both poetry and the psychoanalytic session engages a psychic space outside the boundaries of the ego or its organization, going so far as to test the veracity of the bounded self, a willingness in the poet to atomize one's own ego so that it gets lost in this curious strangeness that is consoling. Keats's famous axiom of negative capability characterized the poet's ego as disinterested, and therefore the poet could slip its identity, or his identity, into other forms, particularly in the natural world, while suffering is transmuted into beauty. Alternatively, Plath used the disinterestedness of the ego to enter into various personas. For instance, Lady Lazarus helped her to relive and overcome the trauma of her first suicide attempt. After giving a brief summary of some of my findings from Freud, drawing from my critical books, I'll then read some of my recent poems. which on occasion have touched on my personal struggles and how trauma and healing exude from the clinical or hospital setting. I find that asylum poems configure periods of confinement as simultaneously protective and threatening. The bars on the hospital window equally keep out danger as well as enclose within. Pain, grief, loss can be transmuted into nature's beauty and can resonate with the reader's own human experience. I recall being asked an extraordinary question that rang true to my experience in particular. What hurt you into poetry? In creative writing and daydreaming, Freud in 1907 discussed creativity as an anticipatory stage of forepleasure, bringing childlike fantasies into reality, beginning with creating a world of one's own by rearranging the things of the world in a new way. Figuration makes representation of the imagined possible. Freud's reasoning that the creative process serves to sublimate otherwise unacceptable emotions led him to conclude that creative writers mark a considerable regression to infantile aggressions and repressed wishes we have protectively concealed from ourselves. Fantasies are unsatisfied wishes, and every art is the fulfillment of a wish. Quote, the writer creates a world of fantasy which he takes very seriously, that is, which he invests with large amounts of emotion while separating it sharply from reality. Psychoanalytic studies beginning in the 1990s demonstrate that the re-experiencing of sensory details encoded during trauma is at the core of recovery. Poetry redirects trauma into another form and releases it through the ordering of elements that unite speech into meaning or representation. In traumatic experience, language appears to be unavailable for two reasons. The experiencer is stunned out of language through physiological changes and through the incapacity of language, which is made from and made for the world of ordinary experience to be used to think through trauma, a paradox. The unavailability of already shared language for thinking and communicating traumatic experience thrusts the experiencer back onto the event, but through tropes or schematic imagery. In long-time trauma, each thought conceives a well-developed world that is maintained for survival alongside the ordinary world. Metaphorical writing especially can have therapeutic effects. Since a poem is not the only thing that goes under revision when rewriting, I think. Often the poet feels real psychic change through this unconscious revelation. A poem should tell me something I've always known deep down, but simply hadn't thought of before. So it is like going home. And that happens through metaphor or simile making. Studies show that creative individuals show the capacity to conceive and utilize two or more opposite or contradictory ideas simultaneously, to see the each within the other and the synthesis of opposites. It was Coleridge who considered the synthesis of opposites, or the making of paradox, the highest form of imagination. For example, in Keats's ode on a Grecian urn, a figure is in motion and motionless. Or in Frosting at Midnight by Coleridge, a chemical is boiling and freezing at once. Metaphors work towards greater and greater condensation through tenor and vehicle. This is an example I like to give my students. The sun, which appears like a penny, becomes a glint of copper flipped in the blue, or the seed that dusts snow like cake flour, to quote Dickinson, powders all the wood. Forming similes demands a rapid amendment of the reality one habitually experiences. The poet synthesizes discordant particulars that would ordinarily never cohere, and finds a connection. Unlike patients undergoing psychotic episodes, creative writers do not believe in the conceptions they create, nor do they allow those conceptions to guide their behaviors. In the poetry of loss, I show how the continuing bonds with the dead, even among the romantic poets, create internalized doubles of lost loved ones present through the very language that marks their absence. At the risk of oversimplifying, Peter Sacks's study, The English Elegy, is founded on Freud's mourning and melancholia, and argues that consolation can be achieved through the poet-mourner's decathexis from the lost one, and finding a metaphorical substitute for the lost object, which goes back to Milton and Spencer, where the dead one who is being mourned is transformed into an eternal symbol of nature, something that does not die, such as an eternal star or flower, which provides solace, even in the face of mortality. This was considered by Freud successful mourning, when libido is gradually withdrawn from the loved one and a substitute is found, so that the mourner is able to stabilize and return to life. However, in melancholia, the melancholic regresses to a primal state of narcissism and does not experience grief in the same way or normative way as the mourner, but feels rejected by the missing or abandoning object. Reacting with anger and humiliation, the object has fled and taken a part of the self, the ego, with it. The part that confirms the ego ideal, the ego ideal. Roland Barthes, as well as Derrida, who I discuss at length, refute the premise that there is ever an end of mourning, only intermittent grief. Jahan Ramazani's The Poetry of Mourning contrarily reveals the anti-consolatory displays of ambivalence and hostility toward the dead, symptomatic of melancholia, noting that repression of guilty complaints about the dead turn the hostility inward, and that becomes depression, manifesting an intense and sometimes debilitating form of self-reproach and self-punishment. We can certainly see this in Sylvia Plath's Daddy. As Sexton once stated, I myself alternate between hiding behind my hands, protecting myself any way possible, and this other ouching other. Hurt must be examined like a plague. And of course, that is resonant of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. If silence is not liberated to speak, it can become its own condemnation. The self, shaken, emerges from under layers of disguises and defenses once it reaches the nascent bottom of its own indwelling feeling, offering consolation and redemption. Pain is a generating motor, a link in the chain of love that makes poetry persist, even when there is so much anguish, one thinks one could never utter a word about it. And yet, there are words, words of wind and sun, words of loss and recovery. And now, I'm going to try some different kind of poems. To the Psychoanalyst, as a segue. You say I built a wall out of my life, So I assemble it, brick by brick, the way clouds materialize out of vapor, unbidden in this bewildered woods. What languor, what gall to keep up that power of obstruction. Unyielding, distant as any paradise, closing out all human voices, where the moon only frowns and flowers are quick to suffocate, as if all this time I could have dreamt there is another side, if only I wanted. Wanting can be anything, but happiness, that ingenious ivy, can shatter even the hardest rock. Fourth floor, Myers, Psych Ward. The moon is an insomniac, an eye that never closes. I can hear the rubbery soles of the night nurse squeaking on buff tiles, janitor mopping up as if it were a crime scene. Above the cinder blocks, there is a barred window in the shape of a black hearse. The hypnomaniac who tried to throw herself from her balcony is pushing her walker in circles. The anorexic refusing to eat, sent to the quiet room. At 10 p.m., we line up with our night meds, our paper cups. The CT scan of my brain lit up like a Christmas tree. Nights we are made to keep our doors open, the infernal blinking of fluorescence in the hall, hurting our eyes, while the tech working the graveyard shift stands guard as if he knew what we were in for. I wrote this poem about midway in my stay at Johns Hopkins, and it was the first poem that offered hope. To the crow by the koi fish pond at Johns Hopkins. There on a candelabra of branches newly lit for spring, I see you shuddering your wings with feathers anointed, your thoughtless pleasure transformed into a three-note unmelodious song. Such caution becomes you the sudden tilt of your saffron beak, a fold-up map of the sky spread out in front of you, your paintbrush tail ticking with old contentment. Through the sun's shadow on the pond, leaves turn clockwise in the call of light. I feel restored by you, where orange and gold koi skim the misty surface in search of a scrim of conspicuous food, the scales of their skin shimming in bright sun, and the swaying of fruit-studded trees. In a world become mute except for your cawing, the muddied air now crystalline, there is nothing more human than this, your voice answering mine. Apple tree on the hospital grounds. More lovely now than you ever were, whether in spring blossom or August harvest, your branches fanning out, rustling like old-fashioned crinoline under a skirt, as you bear yourself alive again at the edge of the woods, dropping your doomed globes, over-ripened but still sweet. Each day you rise in the flesh of dawn, long after the first old apples have fallen. What do you know of time's passing, or the light that your shadow bounds down to? Locked ward, visiting hours. 3 o'clock, and we are expecting our mother's visits to the ward. mine in her feisty hat and no-nonsense shoes, reeking of a cloying rose perfume. An icy nurse ushers them in, asking that they first dispose of anything sharp. One girl's wrist stitched and bandaged, another one's marble veins razor scarred. Each of us displayed like Ming porcelain, or a ship with treasure about to hit an iceberg. Our mother's bad genes handed down to us like secret recipes. Lifelong insomnia, diabetes, fallen ankles. They bring us gossip, change of weather, and teen magazines, and get well cards, each one willing to take a bullet for us, whatever it takes to contain a fire already raging. I had 3 books with me. I had Keats, who I write about in both of my critical books. And the interesting thing about reading Keats's letters or knowing about, I consider myself a psychobiographer of Keats. Very problematic relationship with his mother, who abandoned him 3 times. As you all know, he was desperately in love with Fanny Brawne at the time of his death. But what some don't know is that Keats insisted on being buried. He long knew he was dying and died at the age of 26. That he was buried with Fanny Brawne's letters in response to his. So we have Keats's letters, love letters to Fanny, but we don't have Fanny's letters to Keats. I, however, in writing my dissertation about Keats, read the letters that Fanny had written to Fanny Brawne, Keats's sister. So I knew some things. Reading about Keats's fiancée, Fanny Brawne. At home in Hampstead, dawn's light pulls in cold drafts, rattling door jambs, thick iron locks. The chill is contagious as she steps out in her red hooded cloak through cabbage and celery stalks in search of the carrier pigeon he sent last night from his makeshift post in the tiny parlor. Tomorrow he'll sail to Rome, clutching her gift of a marble oval shaped to fit his palm and clasped so many times to cool her own hands, stinging from sewing. The stone now sent to soothe his febrile skin and remind him of her while she scans the morning sky, a frosted wind bowed to the eel grass, 2 strands tangling into one. Transference, if I have any psychoanalysts out here. Transference. I never told you this, speaking to the psychiatrist. These chairs in your waiting room are the same style chairs my mother bought for our living room, with the blue marble figurines where we never sat. We joked about the living room being a museum. We never went in. It was just for show, for company. When I sit in one of those, I feel my mother's restlessness, her hands-off policy. In framed watercolors on the walls, Butrio's Parisian couples stroll and meet in open cafes, such impostors, still as dust. When your patients come, let them sink in these knockoffs. Let them wipe their tears on tissues. Let them touch the face of the statue that cannot be touched. Let them love you as if this were love. After ECT, the poet. I was already gone. I woke with the blood pressure cuff still on, the nurse offering me a pack of Lornadoons and a Dixie cup of orange juice. She held up her flashcards, then asked, "Who is the president? What year is this? Remember these objects: cat, chair, pen. Count back from 100 by sevens. What were those objects again? Do fish fly in the sky? Strange imagined shapes of things, wild distortions of the familiar. Geese were painted on the back of my eyes, gargling the Listerine ocean. Fish, tiny pinpricks, flying in schools. The sky pondered blue. My sadness still sat like a fat ant that refused to move. They wheeled me back to my room, swaddled in a posy, still hooked to the sack of IV. I'd failed the test. Maybe hereafter they'll move to that crazy woman in the next bed. April, coming home. In the bedroom, I notice you've stacked my things into piles, clusters of everyday items, my grandmother's costume beads, spare reading glasses, prescription bottles that have long expired. It is getting dark. Through the window, the moon shades in its marble, and another woman appears in my mirror. This one too heavy, the other too old to be me. Now I run my fingers over a layer of dust on the tabletop, where in my absence you've gathered my poems, early drafts without beginnings or endings, while in the backyard the cherry blossoms bloom and black-capped chickadees sate at the feeder, the garden still waiting for whatever will come. Day 1301. This is for my husband, who has dementia. There will be a worse day. He will live long enough not to recognize me at all, and I sense it drawing nearer with his measureless stare. The now common pauses, the rummaging for words almost poetic in their wrongness. Whatever his brain urgently seizes upon, now muted by the acoustics of emptiness. For now, I keep his gaze, looking through the surface of his eyes, a pond, drought shrunken, cleared of dust, my own face mirrored there, myself at an impassable distance. At times he seems himself, nothing amiss, and I'm the one slowly banished from memory, as he speaks to me in the third person, nameless, unbidden, figment of the past. I will meet him in the inalterable present, the reminders of love rising and vanishing, like fog burned off from morning, then sunlight returning as if it never left. here's something hopeful. Evening. This is my favorite one. It is time to be tired now. It is time to be quiet. The cherry tree is drunk on breezes. Its blossoms clog the air or bleed into dust. Light will not fail us, nor will darkness. They come like sheep, they turn like pages. I will pull down the shade. It is night now. The fig has sprouted new leaves. The stars glitter on and on. And if prayer counts, I will pray to be lifted and ask that morning deliver more light. And tomorrow I will look out at the bright world to see if something brighter. Listen. Lullaby, 25 years later. She's now 33. This is for my daughter. Listen, night is still sleeping. Why do you keep crying, pulling yourself up by the bars? Oh, trigger of my heart, drooling up last feeding's milk. What good is a lullaby when pacing won't ease you? Heaven's all locked up and guarded. Light thrums through the stars. Look through the window. See the moon is awake, sifting through silky blossoms of pear trees. Watch, watch, as her pale mouth opens, trying to quiet, trying to sing. What's the melody? One day you will know it is me. Silence, an elegy, just two more. Yeah, I had to write an elegy. In the cold rooms of my childhood, my mother is still there, making the beds or sitting up in an armchair, reading her mystery, the lens of her glasses magnifying her eyes into giant bluefish. She is there inexactly as the air she no longer breathes. Her ulcerated legs too heavy to carry her now. Yet she knows who I am and calls, a word falling out of her mouth. I pick it up, the size of a zero, and put it back where it stays, where she stays. And I'm just going to end with this poem. I'm not reading from my books, but I brought some. This is called Felled Oak, which takes place also in an analyst's office. Felled oak. There had been an oak tree, and you know, when you're in a session, you're always looking out the window at something, and all of a sudden that tree had been chopped down. For you, an eyesore, for me, an object of light and form, dignified by age and trust, weathered or beaten, but there, as if it would have reason to stay, as if I had cause to see it as lovely. My world broken apart, as roughly green. Now they've cut it down into a heap, stacked up the curb, its sympathies gone. And you, indifferent to such things, said you were glad to be finally rid of it, obscuring your view, so you hardly noticed when it disappeared, exposing the sky's schematic blue, its warped branches immutable as silence, gone, fixed into place. I stare at you, then look away. I look at myself, passing the mirror, and consider the empty space.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Yeah. If we welcome to take some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions for Judith, please raise your hand and I will repeat them and we can have Judith answer. Well, while you're thinking, I'll say she did mention she has books, so if you'd like a copy of the book after we're done, please go see her. You will accept cash for books and we can help facilitate other short forms of evidence. And a question?
Not a question,
Oh, yes.
a comment. That I just want to acknowledge your bravery and vulnerability in your work.
I appreciate it. I was once at an AWP conference and was on a panel with Donald Hall, who I was very close to, and Raphael Campo. And as you know, Donald Hall wrote the great Without, the book-length elegy. And I was privileged that he thought I was the best critic on Jane Kenyon, his wife. It was a massive crowd, and one woman stood up in the question, and there was a hush and a silence. He was poet laureate at the time, and she asked him, "Do you think, sir, that you are not exploiting the memory and death of your wife by writing so personally about her death?" And he stood up like he was in kind of parochial school or church with his hands behind his back. And he said, "Madam, I write about my life, and my wife was my life."
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Judy. Thank you so much for your awesome essay and reading so many poems for us. You mentioned that in one of your statements you said poetry as a way of making sense of your life, and that certainly helped me when I first took one of your classes. The personal poem was great. And over time, I've been dabbling into other genres of writing. So could you elaborate a little bit more about maybe why you think poetry is more of a venue for this than, say, other forms of writing, or do you think that equally in terms of creative nonfiction or other forms of writing would also help you? So could that statement be writing as a way of making sense of your life, or is there something you feel more strongly about poetry than other forms of writing?
I think that why I brought together poetry and psychoanalysis had to do with Freud, and reading raw Freud, and his first patient, Bertha Pappenheim, referred to psychoanalysis as the talking cure, as a cathartic. But of course, it was through dream and free association. And so, for me, in terms of self-revelation, poetry is, by virtue of it being figurative, the image forms, and the image has some kind of juxtaposition, the way that dream images do. That, for me, there is a kind of purity in that as making sense of one's life. But again, with the caveat that I find kind of humorous, Tina, that Freud would say that echoing Plato, actually, that the artist has the ability to create the work, but only the analyst can understand it. Plato, kind of evicted the poets out of the Republic because he saw them as imitators or craftsmen. But in a later dialogue, he venerates the poets, although they're mad, and he refers to them as ecstatic madness, because they are able to, like Sappho, that they are able to emote. I think that the memoir is obviously a means of self-understanding, and writing fiction is. And I would even say, and I've argued this in college English, that composition is, or academia, but I think it's the purity of the image.
Thank you.
That, yes?
Sorry.
Okay, well, I'm not here. I was going to ask you, you're talking about writing in terms of memoir. But I was wondering, how revealing are some poets in their letter writing?
Yeah.
How revealing are some poets in their letter writing?
It's a lost art, isn't it?
The other question would be, as a critic, would you look at the poems and the letter writing, and to what extent may the letters be more honest than the poems?
You mean the letter writing?
Like you have, people like, some of these writers wrote a lot of letters.
Yes, like James Wright.
Right. So I'm just wondering is that, as you
And
a critic, you have to look at the writing as well as the poetry. But the writing of the letters might be a little more honest than, say, the poem, where somebody might use a persona.
First of all, I want to say about memoir. The first memoir I read was Fathering Words. You gotta read that.
And I was lying throughout that.
Yeah. And he never...
We've got his letters, though. We've got his
He
letters.
never had a father. He never lived in New York. That was poetry on the page. I think to myself, I'm very close to Ted Kooser, so him and Jim Harrison had a correspondence during illness, and so they collaborated in Valentine poems, or it was a kind of letter writing. But the whole question of persona is something that I bring up, I have a chapter in Signifying Pain about the dramatic monologue, and the way in which, it's certainly true of Platt, that using the massive language through a persona is actually very revelatory of a deeper level of the personality. But I haven't read enough letters. I need to read more letters.
Claudia?
Thank you for your bravery and your and I've been thinking a lot about poetry as a way of healing trauma. One example of this that I learned a while back was from poet psychoanalyst Frederick Firestein. Did you know him? Oh, okay. Well, he was a New York psychoanalyst. He passed away in 2020. But he wrote a paper called Trauma and Poetry that expressed his method of dealing with the 9/11 while he was treating patients, and he had to keep himself whole in order to be able to continue to help his patients. And in order to do that, he discovered that a certain way of writing poetry was helping him to get through that, on a daily basis. So I'm just wondering, and that inspired me to teach the workshop. I teach poetry versus trauma. So I'm wondering whether you feel that poetry can actually be used to heal trauma. Have you found that?
I have certainly,
experience?
I have certainly found that with my students. First of all, I wanted to say I have great respect for your description of Dr. Firestone.
Frederick Firestone.
Yes, because there, in psychohistory, which is another field, there's psychobiography or psychohistory, I have learned that there is something called applied poetry, in which psychohistorians are now approaching history through collective traumas like 9/11. And I think that feeds into the idea of anti-consolatory memorials, to keep the wound open in order to remember, so that it isn't closed and we forget and move on. But anyway, I do believe from my students, not for myself particularly, but for my students, and I include a chapter on my students' writing, that they have reported to me a feeling of catharsis through the writing of poems.
But you say that's not true for you?
Oh, it is true for me.
Okay. Well, we're keeping a wound open by definition.
But I guess I'm saying is that it's a matter of, the centered or decentered self, that I think that there has to be a collectivity of trauma understood as private, but also as collective.
Yeah. Well, but if you keep a wound open, by definition, that's not healing.
That's not healing.
So,
But I think, yes, but then Derrida, or Roland Barthes, have you ever read the diary after he loses his mother, where he keeps the grief open, and he's very mad at Freud for even indicating or suggesting that he get over it. So I think there are two sides of it.
yeah, I do think it's different, like on a personal level, and on a social level.
Yes.
Two different types of trauma.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
But of course, and I'll throw in this, because my book on the poetry of loss includes a chapter on second-generation Jews who intergenerational trauma, which was the first that Bambi Okan responded to, where I talk about the unconscious way in which trauma is transmitted intergenerationally. Certain modes of behavior, family styles, replacement children, things like that. So I was very aware of that in writing the elegy book, that it not be just personal, but also, and, as you say, very private and public.
Thanks so much for a really, revealing and insightful talk. As a fiction writer and very occasional poet, I very much believe that writing can heal. At the same time, I wonder if something else, in some instances, something else is going on in some cases. As you were speaking, I found myself thinking about some of the revelations about Alice Munro over the weekend. Some of you may have heard Alice Munro's daughter wrote a column, I think it was the Toronto Star, describing how Alice Munro's husband, the daughter's stepfather, sexually abused the daughter when she was a teenager, and Alice Munro kind of didn't really want to hear it, kind of broke off relations with the daughter, and kind of just sort of left the daughter kind of estranged from her family. And since then, a few people, Margaret Atwood, a few others have kind of in some of Alice Munro's stories, you see characters that are sort of wondering about this, about, sexual abuse and choices not to reveal it. So the suggestion is there that in her writing, what she was doing was kind of managing this rather than confronting it. And so I wonder if in writing, it can be healing, but sometimes it's a way of distancing too. And sometimes people talk about Wallace Stevens in this context, absolutely gorgeous poetry, but a life as an insurance adjuster or whatever, not so emotional with his family. So just curious about your thoughts about it can be healing, but can also be distancing in some instances.
Yes, I didn't talk much about it, even though I've written about it, and when I went back to my first kind of major article, which was on women's confessional poetry, a defense of women's confessional poetry, I kind of skirted the fact that women's neo-confessional poetry, like Sharon Olds, dealt with what some were saying in dispute with it, that it had become incest poetry, or self-exploitive, or self-pity and things like that. And what I go through in that article is Freud's seduction theory, and how egregious, at least at my naive point in my 30s when I wrote it, that it was egregious that he abandoned. At first, his theory was that there were real perpetrators who had seduced and sexually abused young girls. But Jeffrey Masson, wrote about the fact that how egregious it was, that he had made that shift, and whether he was pressured into making that shift. And so then it became the seductive daughter. Now, I don't know if I'm answering your question really, but in terms of that self-distancing and writing about particularly sexual abuse, which I think that was sort of in the 1980s and 1990s, that was becoming a really hot topic. But I am not familiar with the Roe example.
All right, well, I think we can wrap up right there. If you have more questions, please, we'll be here for a little bit. So please come ask your questions in person. Please come get books if you'd like a copy of any of the books. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.